The first time Adriana saw her husband, he was a different man. He would vow, without being asked, that no words were as sweet as music to his ears, and no object as pleasing to his eyes. But now, when she stands before a man who looks just like him, he denies everything. His voice is cold, his words sharp, and Adriana is left to wonder if the man she once knew is truly gone, replaced by a stranger. In the bustling streets of Ephesus, confusion reigns. Two sets of identical twins, separated at birth, have found their way back to the same city. The comedy of errors begins when the wrong twin is mistaken for the right, and the right for the wrong. Adriana, the wife of one of the twins, Antipholus, is caught in the middle of this chaotic mix-up. She sees her husband, but he does not act like the man she knows. His words are not the same, and his actions are inexplicable. The city of Ephesus, with its bustling marketplaces and winding streets, is a place where identities can blur and reality can shift. As the twins navigate this maze, their lives become entangled in a web of misunderstandings and mistaken identities. Antipholus of Syracuse, the twin who is a stranger to the city, is accused of debts he never incurred and is even propositioned by his brother's wife, Adriana. Meanwhile, Antipholus of Ephesus, the twin who calls this city home, is locked out of his own house and accused of madness. As the day progresses, the errors multiply. Servants are confused, wives are suspicious, and the townspeople are bewildered. The world of the comedy of errors is a place where what you see is not always what you get, and where the lines between truth and illusion are constantly blurred. In this world, Adriana's confusion is just the beginning of a series of events that will test the bonds of family, friendship, and love. In the end, the truth will be revealed, but not before the city of Ephesus is turned upside down by the chaos of mistaken identity. The twins will have to confront the reality of their lost brother, and the people of Ephesus will have to reconcile the confusion that has gripped their lives. But for now, the city is a place of uncertainty, where nothing is as it seems, and where the simplest things like recognizing your own husband can become the most complex. In the comedy of errors, the characters often find themselves in situations where their senses of sight and hearing are in conflict, leading to confusion and a questioning of reality. This is particularly evident in the interactions between Antipholus and Adriana, and later between Egeon and his supposed son, Antipholus. Antipholus, moved by Adriana's pleas but confused by the mismatch between what he sees and what she says, wonders if he is dreaming or if he has gone mad. Adriana's words, which are spoken, are deeply tied to her physical presence, and the play emphasizes the connection between spoken words and the sensory world. For example, when Egeon believes he has found his son, he relies on both sight and hearing to confirm his identity, even though Antipholus denies knowing him. Egeon's confidence in his senses, despite their age, underscores the play's theme that sensory perception, while fallible, is crucial for understanding the world. The play also highlights the medieval and Renaissance belief that words have a physical and magical quality. This is evident in the character of Dr. Pinch, who is called a conjurer and a doting wizard. His methods, including exorcism and the use of language to control and heal, reflect a time when words were believed to have real power. Dr. Pinch's ambiguous role as both a healer and a figure of superstition adds to the play's exploration of the boundary between the rational and the magical. Modern readers, influenced by a textual culture that prioritizes written language, might find these ideas surprising. However, for Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the spoken word was primary, and writing was seen as a secondary, sometimes unreliable representation of speech. This contrast between the spoken and written word is important for understanding the play's treatment of language and reality. Dr. Pinch's methods, while seemingly irrational to a modern audience, were perfectly logical within the context of the play's world. In the final scene, the play reinforces the idea that truth can be known through sensory experience, as characters repeatedly use phrases like "I see" and "I hear" to confirm their understanding. This synesthetic approach, where sight and hearing are intertwined, reflects a broader Renaissance view of language as a physical and sensory phenomenon. The play's treatment of language and perception challenges modern assumptions about the nature of reality and the reliability of sensory experience. By exploring these themes, The Comedy of Errors offers a window into a world where words and senses are deeply interconnected, and where the boundaries between the rational and the magical are more fluid than we might expect. In the 1670s, John Dryden, a prominent English writer, grappled with the complexity of Shakespeare's language. Dryden admired Shakespeare's genius but found his language scarce intelligible, ungrammatical, coarse, affected, and obscure. This tension reflects a broader shift in how people thought about language during this period. Dryden believed that the English language had improved since Shakespeare's time, yet he felt it was still far from perfect. He compared English to Italian and French, which he saw as more stable and refined. Dryden's ideal was a language that was fixed and unchanging, a standard that could be applied universally. This desire for a fixed language was part of a new intellectual trend in Europe, where the idea of a perfect, unchanging language was becoming more prominent. This trend can be traced back to earlier writers like Charles de Beauvais, who in 1533 wrote that each language should be understood on its own terms, and that seeking absolute rules was futile. However, by the late 16th century, writers like Henry Estienne were advocating for linguistic purity and fixity, often linking this to social and political stability. This was a response to the civil unrest and social changes of the time. In Germany, J.G. Scatelius responded to the 30 Years' War by promoting the idea of a fixed and pure German language. He, like Dryden, saw language as something that could be standardized and perfected. This idea of a perfect language was also influenced by the Platonic belief that language could reveal the essential truths of the world. The desire for a fixed language was not just about grammar and vocabulary. It was also about social order. In the 17th century, the English language was seen as a reflection of the social and political order. The Civil War had highlighted the chaos that could result from too much variation and too many voices. Royalists saw the variety of languages and dialects as a return to the confusion of Babel, a symbol of social disorder. On the other side, the Levelers distrusted ornate and complex language, seeing it as a tool of deception and manipulation. By the late 17th century, the ideal of a fixed and perfect language had shifted from a common usage to the language of the social elite. Shakespeare, once a towering figure, was now criticized for being coarse and ungrammatical. This shift reflects a broader move towards the standardization of language, where one variety is elevated above others, and all others are seen as incorrect or inferior. This standardization was made possible by the development of print technology and a centralized bureaucracy. The printing press allowed for the widespread distribution of texts, while a strong central government created a need for a standardized language for official documents. This new environment gave rise to the idea that language should be fixed and unchanging, and that variation was a sign of decay or error. Dryden's hope for a fixed and perfect English language was part of a larger cultural and political movement. He believed that once civil peace was established, the language could be refined and standardized, just as the French had done. This vision of a perfect language was not just about linguistic purity. It was about creating a stable and harmonious society. In this context, Shakespeare's language, with its richness and variation, was seen as a challenge to the emerging ideal of a fixed and standard language. Dryden's efforts to correct Shakespeare were part of this broader movement to standardize and control the English language. This movement, which shaped our understanding of language in the centuries that followed, highlights the complex relationship between language, culture, and power. The story of how English became a standardized language is a bit like a puzzle where the pieces fall into place before anyone realizes they are part of a picture. By the start of the 17th century, the pieces were in place: a centralized government, a thriving print industry, and a growing number of people who could read and write. Over the period from 1450 to 1600, a set of language features that we now recognize as Standard English gradually emerged. But this wasn't because someone decided to create a standard. Instead, it was a natural process, driven by the way people communicated and the tools they used. Take spelling, for example. Between 1590 and 1610, there was a noticeable decrease in spelling variations in printed texts. This wasn't because of the spelling reforms that some writers were advocating, which often involved new and complex systems. Instead, it was likely due to the small group of professional typesetters in London, who, as they moved between different printing houses, unconsciously developed and shared a set of consistent spelling norms. These norms were influenced by the house styles of the printing houses they worked in. However, these standardized spelling practices didn't affect how people wrote in their personal documents, which remained much more varied. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, teaching grammar was more about teaching the terminology and analysis of language, not about prescribing correct forms. Students were already fluent in English, and the goal was to teach them the grammar of Latin using English as a familiar reference. The idea that native speakers needed to be taught the correct way to use their own language only emerged around 1700. Before that, it would have seemed strange to think that someone needed instruction in their native language. The 17th century brought changes that made the idea of a standardized language more appealing. The promise of control offered by print technology, the fear of non-elite classes gaining access to print, and the rise of scientific rationalism all contributed to this shift. The new view of language was that the best form was not the one understood by the most people, but the one that could represent the world with the precision and consistency of mathematics. This new ideology saw variation as a problem and presented itself as natural, even though it was a recent development. John Dryden, a prominent figure in the 17th century, is often seen as one of the early prescriptivists. He edited Shakespeare's works, making changes that he believed improved them. At the time, Shakespeare's texts were gaining cultural status, but they weren't yet considered sacred. Dryden saw the words and dramatic material as open to improvement. However, modern editors face a paradox. They modernize the spelling and punctuation of Shakespeare's texts, but leave the archaic morphosyntactic features intact. This selective modernization preserves the appearance of the original while making it more accessible, but it also highlights the tension between reverence for the text and the need to make it understandable. This selective modernization is not a recent phenomenon. It has a long history, with early editors and compositors making changes to align the text with contemporary linguistic practices. Over time, however, the changes became more limited, focusing on surface features like spelling and punctuation. This approach has allowed Shakespeare's texts to be seen as modern while retaining elements that make them distinct from modern English. The shift from oral to written language during the Renaissance is a crucial part of this story. It changed the way people thought about language, leading to the development of the ideology of standardization. This ideology is content with superficial standardization, and is more interested in creating cultural icons than in examining actual linguistic practice. Shakespeare, as an icon of modernity, embodies this paradox. His texts are modernized to appear current, but the core features that make them distinct are preserved, reinforcing the idea that they are timeless and inviolable. The cultural status of Shakespeare and the process of modernization are intertwined. The desire to make Shakespeare's texts accessible while preserving their perceived integrity reflects the broader cultural shift toward a written, standardized language. This shift, which occurred after Shakespeare's time, is often overlooked, but it explains the paradoxes and contradictions in how we treat Shakespeare's texts today. In the end, the story of standardization is a story of gradual, unconscious development, followed by a more conscious and ideological phase. The early standardization of English was a natural process, driven by the needs of communication and the tools of the time. The later ideology of standardization, with its focus on control and uniformity, emerged as a response to cultural and political changes, but it also reflects a deeper shift in how we think about language. Shakespeare's works, rich with dynamic characters and compelling narratives, owe a significant debt to the medieval tradition of personification. This literary technique, which gives abstract concepts like virtue, vice, and fate the ability to act and speak, played a crucial role in shaping the characters and themes of his plays. While personification is often seen as a rhetorical device, it was much more than that for Shakespeare. It was a powerful tool for exploring the human condition, adding layers of moral and psychological depth to his stories. In the Middle Ages, personification was not just a way to make abstract ideas more vivid. It was a means to understand and engage with the ethical and spiritual battles within the human soul. Medieval thinkers, influenced by both classical philosophy and Christian theology, saw virtues and vices as active forces within individuals. This idea was vividly portrayed in works like the 14th-century allegorical poem, Piers Plowman, and the morality plays, which used personified characters to illustrate the moral struggles of their protagonists. The concept of virtue, in particular, underwent a significant transformation during the medieval period. While ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero had defined virtues as stable and ideal states, medieval Christian thinkers saw them as dynamic and often in conflict with vices. For example, patience was not just a virtue, but a specific response to anger or grief. This dynamic view of virtue and vice was central to the medieval understanding of the human soul as a battleground between good and evil. Shakespeare, while not writing allegories in the traditional sense, still drew heavily on this tradition. He used personification to enhance the psychological and ethical dimensions of his characters. In King Lear, for instance, Lear's confrontation with his own pride and the character of poor Tom as unaccommodated man highlights the internal struggle between virtue and vice. Similarly, in 2 Henry IV, Falstaff's physical and moral decline is a vivid illustration of the consequences of vice. The influence of Platonic philosophy further enriched Shakespeare's use of personification. Platonic thought posited that abstract forms have a real existence, even if they are not directly perceivable. This idea was well known in the medieval and early modern periods, and it supported the practice of personification as a way to make the abstract tangible. Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, for example, described a process of understanding that moves from the material to the abstract and back again, much like the process of personification in literature. Shakespeare's characters, therefore, are not just individuals but embodiments of broader ethical and philosophical ideas. They are not walking abstractions, but their actions and speeches often reveal the complex interplay of virtues and vices within them. This approach allowed Shakespeare to explore the human soul in a way that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. In essence, Shakespeare's use of personification was a bridge between the medieval and the modern. It allowed him to delve into the psychological and ethical dimensions of his characters, creating works that are as rich and relevant today as they were in his time. By drawing on the medieval tradition of personification, Shakespeare created a world where abstract ideas come to life, enriching the moral and psychological depth of his plays.